Hello everyone and welcome back to Light Channel Denmark. Today we are going to bring up a very sensitive and needed subject. We are going to talk about how can a child recover from sexual abuse. And we are so blessed having Jennifer Schwirzer with us. She's a director of Abide Counseling out of Florida. And this is the third program which Jennifer is with us. In the first program, she was sharing her amazing story, some of what she was going through as a child and a young person, how many wounds were coming into her heart, and also the blessings of how God has been healing her. And the more we have gone through in life, the more compassionate we become. And in the second program, she was sharing with us another so-called hot subject about the transgender issue. And I have to say that every time I'm listening to Jennifer, I'm learning something. And today she's going to talk about how to recover from sexual abuse. And I was choosing that subject because I have several friends who actually have been abused as a child. And I can see how hard it is for them to live after that. And we are grateful that today she's going to share with us some good news. In Jeremiah's, the first chapter and the fifth verse, it says, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee." So if you are one who is abused, God knew you from the very time you were formed in your mom's belly. He knows what you have gone through in life. He knows the suffering, the pain, the grief, what you are struggling with. And He is more than willing to help. Let's pray. Yes, Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, that you are such a good Father for us, such a good friend. You know everything about us, and you knew us since we were in our mother's womb. You know, Lord, that there are so many children today who are sexually abused. And I cannot imagine how painful it must be, both physically and mentally. Lord, you know how many grown-up young people today are suffering from this, what was happening to them. And we are so thankful that you are able to heal. Please be with Jennifer now as she's going to share what you have been teaching her. And I pray that it will be an encouragement for those who are suffering. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, so I'm grateful for the question, even though it's a very, very difficult question, something that really affects a lot of people. In fact, I want to talk first, before I talk about how to recover from sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, I want to talk about the prevalence because that's a big issue. The prevalence is so high. It's the shocking aspect of this. 25% of girls and 17% of boys, that's 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are the statistics that we see most often, although there are many, have experienced at some point in their childhood sexual abuse. And the reality is that these are probably shy of the actual numbers because they rely on reported abuse. And how many people experience something like that in their childhood and never report it? So it's just really shocking how prevalent this is. It's the way of the world for the strong to exploit and harm the weak. And this is one of the tragic fallouts of that, is that children often experience sexual abuse. And let's just define sexual abuse for a moment here, and in particular child sexual abuse. That would be any sexual contact between a minor and a more powerful person. I'm not even saying an adult, because sexual abuse can occur between children. Most often it's an adult on a child, but it can occur between children. So it's any sexual contact between a minor and a more powerful individual. And that simply means that children are not designed to have any kind of sexual contact. Some people think that it's not abuse, it's not rape, unless it's physically forceful. That is not true. Children are incapable of making a decision as to whether to have sexual contact or not. So anytime a child is involved in any kind of sexual experience, there is abuse involved. So let's just be clear on that. Some other shocking statistics: 95% of victims of child sexual abuse know their perpetrators. 95% of the time this happens, the perpetrator is someone known to the child. We talk about stranger danger, and it's a real thing. We want to teach our children, to be suspicious of and distrustful of people they don't know. That's just common sense. But the reality is, the majority of times, vast majority of times, this happens. It's someone that knows the child, 95%. 25% of children, this is another shocker, were not old enough to attend kindergarten when the abuse occurred. 25% of children who experienced child sexual abuse were not old enough to attend kindergarten. That means they were 3, like barely out of their toddler years, if that, or they were toddlers or babies. It happens more often than we want to admit. So what's the fallout of this? That's something we ask ourselves. When someone experiences that horrible of an invasion at that tender of a stage in their development, what's the fallout? What happens as a result of this? Basically, some people get through it better than others, depending on genetics, home environment, the amount of nurturing and care that you have. A child can weather through some kind of assault much more effectively if they have good parenting or good nurturing or good support going on. But the reality is that often in family systems where abuse occurs, that support is not in place. That nurturing and parenting is not in place. It is not strong. So there tends to be this kind of double whammy effect. So people respond and react differently to these assaults on our dignity, but often people develop mental health issues out of it: anxiety, depression, sometimes post-traumatic stress disorder. So I want to talk about PTSD. And part of the reason I want to talk about PTSD is because I'm in a doctoral program where I'm studying traumatology. And so I'm eating trauma for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I've been thinking about it a lot, studying about it a lot, so I want to talk about it. So there are 2 basic types of PTSD, and let me just break down what that is. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Now, some people object to it being called a disorder because they say, well, it's a normal response to a traumatic event. The reason we still call it a disorder is because it has to be a disorder to qualify for a diagnosis and get insurance coverage to treat it. So there are functional reasons why we call it a disorder, but it is, in a sense, a normal response to a traumatic event. So post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by a number of different symptoms. In the diagnostic manual, it talks about intrusive symptoms, things that just intrude a person's emotions and thought process very suddenly, like flashbacks. Nightmares would be considered intrusive, something that just comes upon you. Another cluster of symptoms are avoidance symptoms, where people want to avoid any kind of reminders of the event. There are also what they call arousal symptoms or activation symptoms, where the nervous system becomes activated and really overactivates in response to those triggers. And then there are a number of other symptoms, sometimes dissociation, and oftentimes PTSD is accompanied by anxiety and depression, various things that affect the emotions or the thought processes of that person. A lot of times there's dual diagnosis. The person has both major depressive disorder and PTSD. But even if they have PTSD without a dual diagnosis, various aspects of depression and anxiety are often involved in it. So that's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's another, not a formal diagnosis, but something that's well understood to be a reality in the mental health community, and that's CPTSD, or complex PTSD. Complex PTSD is a little bit different than PTSD in that the person does not have to be exposed to a life situation. That's one of the qualifications for a diagnosis of PTSD, is you have to have been exposed to a life-threatening situation, or hear about it secondhand, or in some other way experience an extreme threat to your existence or to a loved one's existence. CPTSD can be caused by things that are less of an overwhelming assault in a discrete period of time, but accumulate to be an equal or even sometimes greater assault over a length of time. So think of it in terms of, if I were to, punch you, you could break a bone, or you could bloody your nose, or break a tooth, or whatever. If I were to tap your face, it wouldn't harm you at all, unless I did it for 3 days straight. And then that place where I was tapping your face over and over again would eventually become swollen and injured. So that's the difference between PTSD and CPTSD. CPTSD more often is associated with the extremely dysfunctional or abusive home environment, where maybe the person didn't encounter death or a threat on their life. Their dignity as a human being was assaulted in one way or another over and over and over. And it's very interesting. CPTSD still isn't in the diagnostic manual, but it's well known in the behavioral health field, particularly in terms of a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which was done through Kaiser Permanente and a man named Vincent Felitti. Kaiser Permanente is a hospital system. They had a clinic. People were leaving the program even though they were losing weight. Vincent Felitti started to wonder why this was happening. And so he began research. He began talking to people that had left the program to try to figure out what happened. And long story short, he learned that the vast majority of people that left the program had been sexually abused as children. He started to piece together the fact that when people experience an assault on their dignity, when they're young and vulnerable, it often results in very self-destructive behaviors later in life, like obesity and not even being willing to get well because there's something protective about that extra weight. In fact, they say to be overweight is to be overlooked. I've known more than one person that experienced sexual assault as a child who became overweight because it was protective. At any rate, Vincent Felitti tapped into this reality and ended up interviewing over 17,000 people. And then out of that came the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which show that when we have these adverse experiences as children, the effect of it can accumulate in the nervous system to produce something very similar to what we would call classic PTSD. Let me just give you a quick little vignette from Vincent Felitti's study. This is really interesting. He was interviewing one of the individuals who had left the weight loss clinic, and he wanted to ask the individual, at what age did you have your first sexual experience? That was what he wanted to ask. But he was tired or whatever, looking down at his clipboard, and he accidentally said, "What was your weight at your first sexual experience?" And looking down at his clipboard, he hears the person say 40 pounds. And he looks up, what? Trying to process. She looks down at the floor and says, "It was my father." That was when the light went on for him. Sexual abuse, overweight, health problems, issues. What the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies show is that when people have these attacks on their dignity through these negative home environments as children and various assaults on their personhood, that effect accumulates. They develop behavioral, cognitive, and emotional issues out of that. And then they adopt lifestyle practices that are harmful: substance abuse, medicating with food, gambling. There's just a million ways to medicate. They adopt those behaviors, and then those behaviors produce secondary health problems. And then ultimately, adverse childhood experiences can lead to early death. Now, it doesn't happen in every case, but it tends in that direction. So many behavioral health people are saying that trauma is the big unaddressed health issue in the world today, because trauma, and I see it consistently in my practice, that trauma is kind of the big bad that has all these babies of depression obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, various anxieties disorders, social anxiety, and all of these other children, so to speak. Trauma is kind of the mother. Often these problems can be traced back to some traumatic event or a series of events in the life of that child. So that's the basic difference between PTSD and CPTSD. Often children who have experienced childhood sexual abuse develop CPTSD. So what happens with PTSD? Well, let's talk about that for a moment here. Basically, we think that the way memory processing works is that a person has an experience and their emotions are very aroused after they have a threatening experience. So think of a car accident. Most of us have been in some kind of, or maybe some of us have been in a severe car accident, and you remember that directly after the event, your nervous system was aroused, sometimes for a few days. You keep thinking about the event, you keep processing it, and you keep flashing back on what happened and trying to remember. And so sometimes you have to remember because you have to file reports and so forth. So there's this real heavy processing going on and nervous system arousal as a result of this threatening experience. But over time, typically, your memory gets filed, but the emotional charge of that memory has been removed because the brain processes it. So you can kind of remember what happened without re-experiencing it. I remember a friend of mine that lost her leg in a car accident talking about it with a smile on her face. I was just puzzled by that. But she'd gotten past the trauma of it, and she could talk about it without re-experiencing it. That's how normal memory processing works. We couldn't bear life if every negative experience we had, we re-experience it every time we recall it. God wants us to have an archive of our experiences. It's important that we have a personal history and have our story and can tell our story, but to re-experience it every time we tell it would be overwhelming. But for some reason, we're not sure why. There's a number of different factors. We know that, for instance, unhealthy home environment, lack of relationships, there are various things that can contribute to the development of PTSD or CPTSD, where a person doesn't seem to be able to process memory normally, and they keep experiencing this arousal, this nervous system activation, sometimes flashbacks, nightmares, or even dissociation, where they're there but not there, depersonalization, where they don't know who they are, or derealization, where they don't know where they are. There's just different effects that these traumas can have. Memory doesn't get processed thoroughly. And it's thought that the reason the flashbacks and the nightmares and the triggerability is the brain trying to tell the person, process this, process it. Now, there's quite a bit of research now that trauma is stored actually in the body. There's a man named Bessel van der Kolk who's done written a book called The Body Doesn't Lie, where he shows the effect of trauma on the body. And it's really very fascinating how multifaceted the effect of trauma is. So the million-dollar question is, what do we do once we have these conditions, once we're damaged from these things? And mind you, PTSD and CPTSD are not the only effects of childhood sexual abuse. I'm just mentioning them because they're the most common effects, but often depression, anxiety, these things can flow out of that negative experience. So what do we do when we're in condition? Oh, I want to put a shameless plug in for counseling. I really believe that counseling helps people. And I'll be honest with you, when I first got into counseling professionally, there were a number of reasons I pursued counseling on a professional level. Many of them were just, I thought about being a pastor, but my husband didn't want to be married to a pastor. So I said no to that because I did want to stay possible. And so I ended up in counseling for that and a number of other reasons. But I was a little bit skeptical about it, really, even as I started to practice. Just a little bit, not thoroughly skeptical, but a little bit. But as I started to see the effect and how it could help people and how much it helped me, because actually I mark the point where I transitioned out of depression. to the point where to counseling. Now, it might have been partly because of the things I was studying that were actually helping me, cognitive behavioral therapy, managing your thought life responsibly. There are a number of other things that I was doing that were possibly helping me. It could be that I was making more money than I used to, and that was helpful, and that helps a person feel better. I had been in music ministry, and I'd been in speaking ministry and writing, all three of which never really cashed in a big way financially. I mean, they gave me enough to live on, but counseling was just a better living. Maybe that was part of it. But I think it was also that I was helping people. And I felt significant. I felt like this is really making a difference in people's lives because I started to see how people responded to counseling. And I came to the conclusion that human beings need to talk through what they go through. If you don't have the kind of support network, say you grow up in a home, your parents are self-absorbed, they're off on their own planet, and they don't cultivate that close relationship with you. In the context of that dysfunctional, non-nurturing home environment, you experience some kind of sexual violation, the damage, you don't have the ability to process it with the people that should be there for you to process it. You're not going to be able to process it, and you're not going to heal as effectively as someone who has that nurturing figure who can help talk them through. So what a counselor does is they step into that vacuum and they sort of, can I say this, mother that person in a way. They listen the way a mother should listen to her. They empathize the way a mother should and father should empathize with their child. And they, in many ways, step into the gaps in that person's life and nurture them along and help them, give them a format or a forum in which they can process these devastating events. So often just talking can be super powerful in the case of any kind of trauma that person experienced. A really important aspect of counseling is there's a trust relationship being built. So for the first time in many people's life experience, they're experiencing the building of a trust relationship. Granted, it is a professional relationship. It's a little weird that it's a paid relationship. I don't love that about counseling. I've always felt weird about charging for something that was so much about love and nurturing, but the reality is that counselors can't live on nothing, on air. We're not breatharians. And so there needs to be an exchange of money. It isn't always an issue, or it's hardly ever an issue, I should say. But there is a trust relationship being built in that context. And for some people, and I can think of a number of clients I've had over the last 13 years, I was like, they would tell me I'm the first person they've ever trusted, that I know them better than anyone. It'd be that way, but it is. And thank God for counseling for that reason. So what a counselor will do, first and foremost, if they're trauma informed, before they get into actually processing the trauma, they will impart to the client a set of emotion managing skills, emotional regulation skills, so that they can develop a certain confidence that they know how to calm themselves down. A lot of times people that don't have good mothering, where the mother calms the child down, or good fathering, where the father calms the child down, will end up having a very difficult time calming themselves down. The "it's okay" of the parent on the child tends to become the "it's okay" of the grown adult child upon themselves when they grow up. We self-calm better when we had a good parental calming. And really, children are in a constant state of either anxiety or they feel safe. And they're safe when they're connected to their parents and anxious when they're not. And so it's very crucial that the parent provide that stabilizing for the child. The parent is mind for the child. Child doesn't have a developed cerebral cortex. The child doesn't know that that shadow is not a boogeyman in the closet, but the parent does know that. And so the parent can say, no, that's not a boogeyman, it's a shadow. And the child can calm down. That's how it's supposed to work. You don't have that. You don't regulate. You don't self-regulate as well. So a good counselor will teach that individual self-regulation skills. So let me give you just a few of those. There's a set of things that we call grounding exercises. When people experience traumatic responses, a lot of times they'll dissociate, like I talked about a little while ago. They'll go somewhere else. They'll be so wrapped up in the memory of this trauma or whatever emotional upheaval as a result of that memory that they will not be present. So grounding exercises help us become present. So here's just a few examples of those things. I remember a particular client in the set a hot cup of tea. Just intuitively, I didn't really know a whole lot about grounding at the time, but intuitively I went, got her a cup of tea, handed it to her, and she calmed down because of the warmth of that cup and the physicality of that experience. So that's one way, is to connect with something that's warm or cold. Hot tea. Some people recommend taking ice and holding it in your hands to avert an intense emotional response. That's used a lot in dialectical behavioral therapy, which has been found successful in borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by a lot of emotional dysregulation. So anything warm or cold will kind of bring you back to the present. You can also do literal grounding exercises where you lie down on the floor and feel the weight of your body. Sometimes just focusing in on the weight of your body can be helpful. You can do mental exercises such as name 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you touch, 2 things you smell, and then take a deep, slow breath. That can help to ground an individual. I have a whole document, and by the way, it's free. Go on abide.network. It's a website. Abide.network has something called a toolbox, and there's a whole list of grounding activities you can do if you go on the website and look for that. Another thing that really helps many people calm is breathing exercises. I use a breathing exercise where we inhale to hold for 2 and exhale to 8. When you purposely slow your breathing down, you engage the cerebral cortex, which is the thinking sort of will part of your brain. It's kind of the parent of the brain, if you can think it that way, of it that way. So if the amygdala is over aroused and just going crazy, it's like the child of the brain having a tantrum. The cerebral cortex comes in and says, it's okay, you can calm down, and the child calms down. That's what happens when you engage in what we call conscious or deep, slow breathing. What I do is have people breathe as if they're holding a tiny straw in their lips. So it goes like, and I'll try to slow them down to where they're breathing that slow. When you do that, it can really calm you down. It's very, very powerful. I encourage people to do the breathing exercise, which again is on the toolbox on the Abide Network website. That's abide.network. Go there, look for toolbox, look for breathing. If you have trouble finding it, you can fill out the contact form and we'll help you. Practice that breathing for a couple of minutes every morning when you first wake up, and then use the breathing whenever you feel anxious. That's what I recommend people do. It's not difficult, it's free, never hurts anyone. Breathe too deep and too fast or you'll hyperventilate and pass out, but this shouldn't cause hyperventilation if it's done right. So look for that document. There's another aspect of emotional regulation that is called radical acceptance. So what we typically do when we feel emotional is we develop secondary disturbance. Secondary disturbance is when you're disturbed about being disturbed. You're disturbed, anxious, sad, scared, but then you're disturbed that you feel anxious, sad, and scared. That's called secondary disturbance. I like to try to resolve a secondary disturbance first. So that involves radical acceptance. By the way, there's 2 forms of secondary disturbance. One is the moral form and the other is the pathologizing form. Moralizing and pathologizing. Moralizing would say, I'm a Christian. I shouldn't be anxious. God says, no, don't be afraid. This is a failure on my part. That's moralizing. That's judging yourself for having those emotions. They're just emotions. They're not who you are. The pathologizing form says, I am sick. This is going to destroy me. I'm going to have a heart attack and die, where you exaggerate the negative effects. True anxiety does have some negative health effects, but we can exaggerate it and pathologize really a normal gamut of emotions. So that all leads back to my point about radical acceptance. Accept that you are experiencing intense emotion, and that's it. It's not who you are. Who you are is who you choose to be and who God says you are, and how you choose that in response to what he says, but it is not the momentary fleeting emotions that you are experiencing in this moment. Those can come from anywhere. They can come from the music playing in the grocery store. They can come from trauma you've experienced in the past. They can come from a smell that you pick up that you're not even conscious of. Emotions come from, it could be from what you had for lunch, your time of the month, your moon cycle, as they say. So you're going to have emotions based on a lot of different things. They're just emotions. Accept that you are experiencing those emotions in the moment. That is, by the way, what they call mindfulness. And mindfulness is biblical. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but call me a heretic. The thing that's working for people about the mindfulness exercises that are being promoted in the behavioral health field are actually biblically origined. And I can send you stuff about that too. So radically accept your emotions. Then there's a paradox here. Accept your emotional distress. At the same time, do everything you can to resolve the emotional distress. So that's where cognitive behavioral skills come in. The best treatment for trauma is trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, from what I understand in the research. Cognitive behavioral therapy is merely learning how to manage your thought life. I want to also insert, though, that when there's severe trauma, there's a school of thought that says you also need, cognitive behavioral is a top-down approach, straighten your thinking out, and the emotions respond. There are also that combine that with a bottom-up approach, because what can happen when people have been severely traumatized is they're very compartmentalized. They think a certain way over here, and then they have a totally different emotional experience over here. So the reason we go top-down is because we want to connect those two and integrate them. So I'll tell you a very simple exercise that I do in counseling that really seems to combine both of those things. When people are talking through something distressing, I will say to them, and I use the acronym PLAIN, P-L-A-I-N. Okay, so that's permission, label, area, intensity, and narrative. Okay, PLAIN. This is also in the toolbox. So what I ask permission. Can we just explore that emotion for a moment? Say yes. I say, label that emotion for me. What do you think that is? It's really healthy for us to have to label our feelings. It's really, really a good maturity growth thing to do. So you're not indulging emotionality by mentioning that you have these feelings, just being accurate about it. I have this conversation with my husband where he says, I don't want feelings, I want facts. And I say, the fact is I feel this way. So feelings are facts, we actually feel that way. So label it. Second thing is area. Where do you feel that in your body? Often it's in the chest or the stomach or the throat or in the head. It's really healthy for people to look at how those emotions affect them physically. This is the bottom up that I was talking about a moment ago. So, yeah, where is it in your body? And then what is the intensity of that emotion? Usually on a scale of 1 to 10, it'll be 5 or 6. And then I'll say, what is the intensity when you're actually in vivo, not just telling me, but actually experiencing the trigger? What is the intensity? We'll talk about the intensity of it. And then finally, if you could give that emotion a voice, what would it say? A lot of times right then and there, they'll blurt out something that turns out to be their core belief, something like, no one will ever love me, or I'll always be rejected by everyone, or nothing is safe. No one is safe. There is no place on earth where I will be safe. These are core beliefs that the individual has adopted, and all of their dysfunctional thinking and functioning really flows out of those core beliefs. So once you've distilled down to the core belief, which, by the way, typically has to do with the person other people, or the future. Those are the three things that form the basis of our core beliefs. So once you've distilled down the core beliefs, you have something with, and you can start to wrestle with, is it true that no one can ever be trusted? Let's explore that. Let's talk about it. Let's nuance that. Let's get deeper into that. And you can help that person integrate what they've experienced with actual reality. So that's cognitive behavioral skills combined with what we call sensory motor or bottom-up processing. Boy, I'm giving you guys a lot of stuff. I'm giving you my whole practice in one 45-minute segment. Have people that you can call. What a good trauma-informed therapist will do is have that person identify the support people in their life that they can call on when they're having an upsetting experience. Just the ability to reach out. And of course, we want to reach out to Jesus and pray to him as well. But a lot of times human beings can really reinforce the existence of God. I don't see it as when we reach out to people, we're not depending on God, although it can be that way. But I see it more as when we reach out to people, we're basically affirming that God exists because he lives in the hearts of those people that care about us. That's how I see it. There's a few things you can do that are helpful in the moment that will help manage some of the nervous stimulation involved in trauma that I just want to mention here. There's something called the Valsalva maneuver. It's stopping your breath while trying to breathe out. So it's basically, and that apparently calms the vagus nerve, which is the nerve that goes all the way down from your brain through your spine into your stomach. Humming is also a calming little intervention you can do while you're going around your daily duties, start getting depressed or upset. That can be helpful. That can calm and help the vagus nerve. If you start becoming dissociative and checking out, go to your sink and splash some water, particularly on the floor. That's called the diving reflex. That will stimulate the vagus nerve. So there's different things you can do to help manage your nervous condition. Once that set of skills has been imparted to the client, the counselor will then start to work through the narrative with a client. And there are many ways that we can do this. We can just tell the story. Some people want it told in detail. Some say it's not necessary to tell it in detail. But I find that journaling, people writing out their story can be very helpful depending on how much they love to write. People can draw their story. They can use art to portray their story. There's a lot of place for creative approaches to the narrative aspect of therapy. There's people that use dance. There's people that use art. There's people that use music. Music is very powerful. I love using music. I think music is very therapeutic, particularly participatory music, where you're actually helping create the music. That's why it's important that we do congregational singing and that church doesn't become a spectator sport, engaging and creating the sound ourselves. So music can be very therapeutic. And some people are songwriters and they can write poetry or songs that convey the story. I've done some of that myself. Another therapy that is used, I don't practice it formally, but I practice a modified form of it, is called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Some people think that EMDR is too much like hypnosis. I don't really like hypnosis because the hypnotist is controlling the mind of the client. I don't really like that. I'm not comfortable with that. Some people think that EMDR is that, but actually in EMDR, the client retains control. And that's very important in trauma processing, that the client retains control, that you don't force them at any point to go farther than they want to go in facing the difficulty. So EMDR, they're still in control, and it's a form of moving your eyes back and forth across the field of vision, which is thought to bilateralize the brain and put it in a condition it more effectively processes material. Well, there's a modified that where I take people on walks. I think bilateralizes the brain. It's a left activity and powerful. So I will talk through trauma sometimes with people while we are walking. There are other forms of trauma treatment. Systematic desensitization is basically talking through the trauma in a relaxed, bringing the person into a relaxed state and then working through the trauma in that relaxed state so they form a new association. between I am relaxed and these events instead of I'm scared out of my mind when they remember those events. And I'm just throwing things out here. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, I got a phone call. I will be back to him in a minute. So let me just throw out a few things in closing here. There's a wonderful field of study called post-traumatic growth, and I want to end with this thought. I noticed a difference between what I was reading in the scientific literature and the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative said this light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. It was like saying that our trials on earth do not ruin us. In fact, they're effective in creating something better in us. But then the literature seemed to be saying when people had difficult experiences, it ruined them for life and they would be compromised or have to go through extensive therapy. I think both of those things are in a sense true. But I thought maybe there's something in the literature that shows that people can actually grow from these very traumatic experiences. And I found it. It's called post-traumatic growth. There's a body of literature. And it basically says that certain people, if they have a spiritual framework that they work from, if they have social support, if they learn how to accept what happened, and a few other factors, can actually grow, and trauma can deepen them as individuals where relationships are more meaningful. They have more of a sense of purpose in life and a number of other things. So there's this whole world of post-traumatic growth that I just love because it aligns with the biblical picture, which is that I can harm a person in the moment, but then God takes the devastation and pieces of our experience and he fashions out of it a beautiful masterpiece that really deepens our relationship with him and with other people throughout eternity. And so I want to leave you with that thought. I have a lot more I could say, as you can see, but may God bless you and keep you is my prayer for you and in your recovery. Oh, by the way, lest I forget, Abide.network, we counsel a network of 20 counselors and coaches work and help people all around the world. So though you be in Europe, though you be in Africa, we can work with you. We've had clients all over the world. Abide.network, reach out to us, go on the website, fill out the intake form, and we will find someone to help you. And they will be reasonably priced. We will try to work with your budget. And I believe that you can get help. So may God bless you. Thank you for the opportunity of sharing.